Hey there, welcome. Today I am talking about boundaries. So I'm excited to be with you today. If you've never joined me for a live call, what I will do is do some teaching and I will answer questions and I will hopefully have time for live coaching at the end. So I'm going to talk to you about boundaries today. It's a word that people use and it's often misused, and there's a lot of confusion around what boundaries are, when they're used, what they're for. So, we're just going to have a great discussion about boundaries today, and I hope that I will clarify a lot of the confusing things about boundaries. So, a boundary, by definition, is something you create for yourself. It's commonly used in coaching to help clients achieve life-changing results, but it can be mistakenly used as a way to control other people. But that's not really the function of a boundary. Our goal is never to try to control anyone else. It's not possible, for one thing, and it's only an illusion if you think you're controlling someone else. That's just your thought, and it's only an illusion because you technically cannot control anyone else other than yourself. So, I want you to think of an emotional boundary like a property boundary. It defines where one person ends and another person starts. It's a way of drawing a line or a circle around behavior and ourselves. It may seem like a boundary would separate us from others, but it's really quite the opposite. Actually, it helps us connect more authentically with others when we use boundaries. So, a boundary includes a request that you make of someone to change a certain behavior and a consequence of what you will do to self-protect if they violate the boundary again. Because healthy boundaries promote self-responsibility and empowerment, and they lead to closer relationships with others. It's true. And I know you may not believe that right now, but I think as you come to have a better understanding of what boundaries really are, you will understand that imposing them helps you have a better relationship and connection with people in your life. By contrast, weak boundaries or not having boundaries at all promotes enmeshment in relationships and emotional childhood behavior, which only distances us from others. And I talked about emotional childhood a couple of weeks ago. So please go back and listen to that or watch that recording on emotional adulthood and childhood if you haven't watched that one yet, because that's important basis to help you understand boundaries. Okay. So when and how do we set a boundary? Before setting a boundary, you must be clear to yourself about what your personal boundaries are. Most people have a clear line around their home or their property, which makes it easy to know when someone has crossed it. But many people are not as clear about their personal boundaries. So often they're not aware that someone has crossed a personal boundary until it's happened. Okay. I hope that makes sense for you. Here's an example that'll clarify. Do you allow people to yell at you? If not, what do you do when it happens, when someone yells at you? Some people have a boundary in this area and others don't. Also, boundaries need to be communicated when someone has violated them. For example, most of us have a boundary around physical violence, right? If someone is hurting us in a physical way, We know we're not going to tolerate it and we're going to leave the situation or call the police if it happens. But we don't walk around all the time saying, by the way, don't hit me or I will run away and call the police. Do we? We don't need to broadcast our boundary all the time. Basically, we need to be aware of it and very much aware of what our action will be when someone violates it and prepared to impose it when a violation occurs. So if someone were to hit you or harm you physically in some way, you know, I'm ready to respond the way that I know I will respond if someone violates my boundary. Okay. So once a boundary has been violated, we need to communicate to the person that they've crossed a boundary and clearly state the consequences if they don't stop it immediately. So if someone comes into your backyard, they violated your boundary. You can either lose control and yell at them, or you can say, hey, you need to leave my yard now. I'm not okay with you being here. And if you don't, I'm going to call the police. By saying this, you're letting them know right away that they have violated a boundary and what action you will take if they continue to do so. So you use 2 steps to effectively set an emotional boundary: the request and the consequence. 2 steps. So when you make the request, you ask someone to stop doing the thing that infringes on your property, literally or emotionally. And second, the consequence. You tell the person what you will do if they do not comply with your request. It's simple. It's really not complicated. The boundaries you set are meant to protect you emotionally. So you need to clearly communicate when a violation has occurred. You may set a boundary with your boss. If, let's say, you have a boss that yells at you, and you may need to communicate a boundary with them by saying, listen, if you continue to raise your voice towards me, I'm going to leave the room until you can speak calmly. If it continues, I'm going to go to HR and discuss the situation. This ultimately allows your boss to choose how they will behave, but clearly describes what you will do if the violation continues. You make the request, you give them the option to do whatever they would like to do, and then you follow through on your request. Those are the 2 steps. So maybe you have a friend who is always late. You could decide to interpret this behavior as bad or wrong or rude or disrespectful. And you could just decide, I'm not going to hang out with this person any longer because they don't respect me and they're always late. But you could also decide to set up a boundary rather than shutting out this friend and cutting them out of your life completely because they're late. You could say something like, hey, I really want to meet you for lunch, but I know sometimes you run late. So I'm going to plan to wait for 15 minutes for you, but then I'm going to leave or just eat lunch by myself. I'm not going to be mad about it or upset with you, but I just don't want to wait around for more than 15 minutes. So by setting a simple boundary, you take away all of that drama and emotion that's unspoken between you and the other person. You, let's say, by assuming all of those thoughts about your friend because they're always late, and you could assume that they're disrespectful or rude or that they don't value your time. And you could make it mean a lot of hurtful things because they're late, or you could just communicate a boundary and let them know upfront, I love you. I want to eat lunch with you, but I don't have, an unlimited amount of time. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait for 15 minutes. And then if you don't come in that time, I'm going to go ahead and eat by myself, or I'm going to leave, or I'm going to go eat with someone else. And then you get to have the self-respect and the confidence that you value yourself without assuming and imposing all of these hurtful thoughts about or towards your friend that aren't necessarily true. So simply setting a boundary like this allows your friend to be whoever she or he wants to be, behave however they want to behave, but it also allows you to protect yourself, your emotions, and your time by creating a boundary. It's really simple. Okay, so it can be difficult to figure out when to set a boundary. And this is where a lot of people get confused is many people think a request is a boundary issue. So let me give you some examples. If you want your husband to take out the trash, that's your request, but this is not a boundary issue. Some other examples would be, I would like my boss to give me more praise. That's not a boundary issue. That's a request or a wish. I would like my girlfriends to call me back when I call them. That's just a wish. I would like my husband to be more romantic. That's just a wish or a request. All of these examples that I gave you are requests that fall under the definition of a manual. And if you have been with me for the last couple of weeks, we have talked extensively about manuals. So those things, those examples that I just shared with you, those requests, those would fall under the category of a manual that you have for that person. So we could do some more work on that and discussion on manuals if those are thoughts or wishes that you're having. That's not the time to apply a boundary. All right. It is okay to make requests of people in your life. All of these things I mentioned, like asking your husband to take out the trash or asking him to be more romantic or, letting your boss know that you would like some more praise or positive reinforcement or asking your girlfriends to call you back. It's totally fine to make requests of people in your life. But when your happiness and emotional well-being depends on their fulfilling the request, that's when you have a problem. That's when you're trying to control other people to feel better. That is not healthy. So those are situations that you need to recognize when you have a lot of emotion around those requests or when someone isn't meeting those wants that you have. That's when we can explore a manual and talk about, that whole situation. In these situations, the person isn't violating your personal or physical space by not honoring your request. All of the examples I list about the garbage, being romantic, more praise from a boss, or a callback from a girlfriend, none of those situations are violating your emotional space. So they're not boundary issues, and it's not appropriate to create a consequence in those situations. Doing so is a form of manipulation, and it's threatening behavior. So just be aware of that. If those are things you're doing, you need to stop doing those things right away. Boundaries should always come from a place of love and promote self-kindness. A boundary is not an ultimatum. This is something that I think a lot of people are confused about. A boundary is not an ultimatum. It's not a way of controlling another person so that we feel better. This never works. And it is completely disempowering and separating from other people. People don't like to be controlled or forced. And the truth is that an ultimatum is actually a boundary violation against the other person. So let me give you an example. Okay, I have a client named Susan, or I'm going to use it. This is not the real name, but we'll use an example of someone named Susan. And her mother-in-law likes to come by the house unannounced to see her grandkids and often enters the house without knocking first and just shows up uninvited. To Susan, this is a boundary violation. But because she continued to allow it without saying anything to her mother-in-law for years, it's very likely that Susan's mother-in-law didn't know that this was something, she was unhappy with. So Susan decided out of love and self-kindness to set a boundary with her mother-in-law. She said to her mother-in-law, "We love spending time with you, and I'm so glad that you love spending time with us and our kids. But I really need you to give me a call and let me know when you would like to stop by so I can tell you whether it's a good time. If you don't call first, the door may be locked and we may not be here, or we may be in the middle of something else and just not answer. Calling ahead would be better for me because I would know when to expect you, and it would be better for you so that you don't show up and find no one home." This is a very reasonable boundary with a clear consequence if the violation continues. It's important that Susan follows through with the consequence, which can be difficult. This is like it can be a difficult area with people that you care about. I know it seems harsh to say that locking the door would be the consequence. And, Susan was worried that her mother-in-law might not react well to that, finding the door locked. But failure to follow through and act accordingly to the boundary sends the message that the boundary really doesn't exist. And what ultimately happens, this is the most important part of why boundaries are important. So if Susan never set a boundary, never openly communicated with her mother-in-law and made her request and told her the consequence, then her mother-in-law would have continued to come over unannounced all the time. What happens with Susan is she started to feel frustration and anger, and it slowly built up over time into resentment and resistance and bad feelings because Susan wasn't honest and open in communicating how she really felt. Do you see how not communicating your true feelings really hurts the relationship? She thought she was being nice by continuing to allow her mother-in-law to keep coming over unannounced or uninvited at times that weren't, best for the family. But what it did is hurt their relationship because Susan built up all these feelings of anger and resentment. And, that's when we start telling stories in our mind about what maybe the mother-in-law is thinking or doing. And we don't know if that's true or not, but people can feel when you're not happy with a situation. We think we're good at hiding it and pretending like everything's fine, but we're not. We all pick up on all these nonverbal clues, and we're aware when someone isn't happy with us being there or unhappy with the situation. And so Susan's mother-in-law definitely was picking up on some unwelcome vibes and unhappy feelings there. And so it could have been building up resentment on both sides. And it doesn't foster an intimate relationship on either side, but rather it caused Susan to create a lot of unnecessary drama and conflict towards her mother-in-law. And her mother-in-law may not have even realized she was contributing to that. So can you see how not setting a boundary was hurting their relationship? Whereas setting a boundary from a place of love and genuine interest in the long-term health of the relationship can allow both of them to feel love and mutual respect for each other. They can just relax and enjoy the time that they do get to spend together and with their children and grandchildren. as really just a mutual enjoyment of their time together instead of unspoken, unresolved feelings there. At the other end of the spectrum, some people don't want to set proper boundaries because they don't want to risk losing relationships. They're afraid that if they take care of themselves and they tell the truth, they might make the other person angry or upset. So, in order to avoid the other person losing control, they stay in relationships that are based on lies and pretenses and resentment. Do you see how that happens when we don't communicate how we really feel? It prevents any true intimacy in a relationship. So having a conversation about the boundary can be uncomfortable and challenging. And it's hard work, but it's the work of true intimacy and honoring yourself and what is authentic and true with you, along with the willingness to let other people interpret it however they will. It's difficult. It's not easy to do that, but it's worth it in the end. People who can't find the courage to have conversations like this stay in relationships where they're pretending and they're not showing up as their true self. And then they wonder why their relationships lack intimacy or they're not deep and connected. Or worse, the relationship erupts and blows up in the end because of all the built up resentment and hostility. And then we blame the other person for our lack of boundaries. It's really interesting. Okay, so there's a book called Boundaries, written by Henry Cloud, and he teaches that we must love and honor ourselves enough to tell the people in our lives the truth and to set proper boundaries. This isn't just for us. It's for the sake of the person doing the violating. Often, this person is not aware of how you are feeling. Others don't have to understand or even agree with your boundary. And you should be prepared for that. When you set a boundary out of love for yourself and the other person, you can tell them your truth without attacking or yelling at them. You can come from a place of peace and respect for yourself and for them. And your truth really has nothing to do with them. You can tell them that you're setting a boundary from a place of love and confidence. And if they choose to be hurt or upset, it's not your fault. That's their choice. And so long as you come to the discussion from a positive, loving place, then you can feel peace about that. And what happens in the end is that you can move forward in your relationship from a place of authenticity and without resentment and really showing up as your true self, which is the ultimate goal in every relationship, right? Your relationships will become more genuine and intimate when you're willing to do this work. It's challenging, but it's so important. So many people worry about maybe being viewed as bad or rude or uncaring when they have a boundary conversation. And the ironic thing is that that is how they generally act when they don't have a boundary conversation: rude and uncaring or bad. So when you try to smile and act like everything is fine, but you're seething underneath and you're really angry and resentful, you are acting exactly how you are trying to avoid acting. Think about that. When you tell someone the truth about yourself, you open the space for more honesty, connection, and truth in that relationship. All right, so there's a few things I want you to remember about setting boundaries. Proper boundaries come from a place of love. If you're angry, frustrated, mad, you'll want to work through all of those feelings before you go to have a boundary discussion, or even really start to decide where you want to set a boundary. It's helpful to write down your feelings, journal about it, talk to your spouse about it, or a trusted friend or coach about it. This is a perfect thing to get coaching on. So bring it to your one-on-one coaching sessions and work through them until you can get to a place of calm, peace, and love. And remember that the reason you're upset in a boundary violation situation is not because this person has violated your boundary. It's because you haven't set proper boundaries and you haven't been speaking your truth about them. When you can own that and take responsibility for your own emotions, and you can explain your boundary from a place of love and set clear consequences for what will happen if it's not honored, then you can have a wonderfully successful boundary conversation, and you don't have to be afraid to share what you're doing is out of love. It's really the best way to handle it. Okay. Here's an example. You could say, look, if you want to have this discussion, look, this is a boundary issue for me, and I'm not comfortable with this going on. So if this continues, this is what I'm going to do. I think you're wonderful and magnificent, and I value our relationship. That's why I want to be really clear and straightforward about this. And then make your request and outline the consequence. Always remember that the other person in the relationship gets to choose how they will act in response to your boundary notification. When you set up a clear boundary and it isn't honored, you'll need to follow through on your consequence. And many people do this from a place of anger or frustration because they think thoughts like, what the heck? I just set a clear boundary and you're still coming over without calling. And now you're forcing me to lock the door. Remember that people get to act however they want to act. They're not forcing you to do anything. It's your boundary and your consequence, and you'll want to enforce it from a place of peace and love. So there's no need to ridicule the other person, make them feel bad or wrong for their behavior. It doesn't feel good and it's not necessary. Just emphasize for yourself and the other person that this is how you are taking care of yourself, and it's nothing against them. Be very clear about holding up the boundary. And many times people will continue to violate boundaries because in the past you didn't have any. So they're going to keep doing what they've always done. You just stay in a place of confidence and peace and love. And when you honor and take care of yourself by enforcing your boundaries, then they will ultimately recognize that the consequence is going to be in place, and they have a choice at that point to respond however they like. So, I have so much more to say about boundaries, and I see that we're out of time. So I think I'll pick up this discussion next week, and I will leave time for coaching. I really appreciate you guys listening in and getting a good foundation about boundaries and why they're so important to have healthy relationships. And I can't wait to talk to you about it more next week. So come back and we will pick up where we left off. Thanks, y'all. Have a good week.